So welcome Stacie CC Graham to Keen on Yoga. Stacie is the founder of OYA brand for women of colour. And I'm really pleased basically to have you today to share a little discussion. Welcome.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, it's great to see you. And Stacie's coming from London today. So I feel slightly nostalgic that she's back in London as I'm... Well, you can see from this umbrella behind me that I'm actually in Bali. They have these yellow umbrellas everywhere, you can see. I'm currently in Bali, which is a long way from London. And I think I'm on the front foot, as it were, because Stacie's waking up at 9 and I'm very woken up now at 4 with much coffee in the system, so ready to go. Anyway, I'll quit that babble and we'll just get straight into the nuts and bolts of it. Stacie, can you just explain a little bit, what inspired you to start the brand and how it's developed, and we can take it from there, I suppose.
Sure. I founded OYA Body, Mind, Spirit Retreats in 2016 here in London. And it's specifically for Black women and women of color. And it didn't matter where I was in Europe when I took part in different types of retreats, whether it was wellness, meditation, I was always the only one. Not only is that particularly uncomfortable when in a space where you want to be able to talk about your full life's experiences, but it also can lead to a particular tension as the only one of anything. I'm sure people who are male identified experience that sometimes in yoga spaces that are full of women. And for me, there's this multidimensionality because I'm not only a woman, I'm a Black woman. And it's always kind of this unspoken thing in the space. And I never felt like I could fully allow myself to be present to everything that was coming up. I always felt like I had to regulate for other things coming up with different people, a bit on guard about what people may or may not say. And so I just recognized that it would be really useful to create a healing space for Black women and women of color where we're coming from similar points of departure. Of course, we all have our own experiences, but there's a shared understanding, and it makes it easier to arrive in the space and really get into the work. Yeah.
I mean, when you put it like that, it makes perfect sense. I think when you're doing something so vulnerable anyway, opening yourself up in such a way that it's so profound and I mean, and no one can know how that feels until you start doing the yoga practice, and you kind of realize when you move your body, and it's different to playing football or we call it football, soccer, or whatever whatever else. It's a different experience. And you need to feel really supported. And I think I felt increasingly that the yoga scene, when you walk into the room of a yoga studio, even as a teacher, I often felt like, kind of like, this is a bit harsher than the outside world, right? Like I felt more comfortable on the street than in here. So, I mean, and that's just me being like of a default, regular, how would you call it? Like I'm a white male, basically, so like I was roughly amongst peers. I mean, okay, there's more women there, but, so, I can absolutely understand it. I mean, and I suppose how have people perceived that? You've had a little bit of pushback generally from white women about feeling excluded, right?
Yes. So I have to say, I'm not too concerned about it because that feedback has been very minimal. I think people just like to cause commotion where they can. But often I have asked, when people say something on Twitter, for example, I'll ask, so are you concerned that you're not allowed to participate? Because the question is often, well, what about white women? And I'll ask, are you concerned about your not being able to participate? Because you haven't asked about anyone else. You haven't said, what about Black men, for example? You haven't asked about men of color. You just said, what about white women? And then, it's normally crickets after that. So I come from a place of, let's focus on how we can create community. And I don't think anyone can deny that. They're specifically here in the UK and in London, we have built community in South Africa. We've been in the Netherlands. We've been in Vienna and so forth. And to my great surprise, we even have people who fly all the way from the US for every retreat that we offer, which is amazing to me. So I really come from a place of building community, and it's clear to me if people are willing to fly hours and hours to be a part of that community, that we're offering something that is needed. And that's my focus. That's how I talk to faculty members about it. I just remind people, let's not get caught up on the few people who are willfully trying to misunderstand what we're doing. And let's really focus on the community that we're serving.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy. You've got men's yoga, right? I mean, you've got all kinds of, why can't we split into groups and do and have opportunity for people basically to find a group where they feel comfortable in? Bottom line, right? Because it is an intense practice, and you need to, and you don't want to be feeling in any which way that you're trying to regulate yourself amongst a whole bunch of people that you feel you haven't had the same experience with. I mean, I've even had that walking in to a room in upscale yoga centers when I'm from a different background, or I'm a man actually, with 90% women, or so I can understand that. I mean, you've done now British Wheel of Yoga teacher training as well, so you're kind of branching out with it. And is this with OYA as well? You were a consultant for British Wheel.
So at the time, it was Paul Fox who was the chair of the British Wheel of Yoga. I love Paul. Paul and I are good friends now. We didn't know each other then, though. But basically, I reached out to the British Wheel of Yoga to say, is there something that we could potentially do together? Because at that time, I had been offering community yoga classes. And I had so many women who would come in, and after just a couple of times, they would say things like, oh, now I feel confident enough to move into a studio space. That's how intimidating it can be from the outside if you've never gone into one. And so I reached out to the British Wheel of Yoga. Paul was super excited because at the time he was very focused on how can we open up the British Wheel of Yoga, which is traditionally an older middle-class white institution. How can we open it up to the people who are clearly missing from our membership? And so I worked with him and another person named Jazz Mullings Lambert, who at the time was the regional lead for North London at BWY. And we offered a 2-year Women of Color course to become trained through the British Wheel of Yoga. It was a phenomenal course. It was a wonderful experience. I know that Paul and I can speak for Paul a little bit because he said it to me previously. He said it was one of the best experiences he's ever had. And he has taught a lot of people. So it was a special, the British Wheel of Yoga hasn't offered it again since. Paul is no longer chair. But those women who we met on the course, we're still in touch with, and we're still working with them. They still come, many of them attend OYA retreats. Some of them work with Paul. One even worked with him on his book where she was photographed doing the postures in his book. So this isn't just about getting bodies in seats and getting bodies certified. It's really about creating something different.
I think that comes across very clearly. I remember going into British Wheel actually as a young man. I was maybe 19 or something like that, about 19.
Oh, wow.
And this was in the late 90s. And I mean, I don't know. I felt like, I didn't feel unwelcome, but I just definitely felt like I'm very much the odd one out. I mean, there's all these older ladies.
Right.
There was maybe one old guy, and there was a conference. I remember the regional conference, and it was in Stratford upon Avon.
Okay.
And we went up there. Yeah, we went up there, and I was excited. I'd been doing hatha yoga with my teacher, right? And there was a very profound practice and experience I'd had. And then I went up to the conference, and it was like 100 ladies, probably over 50, probably middle class, and then there was one older guy, I think, and me. And I think at that time, they were very nice, but that's the thing, isn't it? I mean, it's not a question of people pointing the finger and going, "You're the odd one out." It's just a feeling of like, this is not quite fitting in. Do you know,
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't have to be overtly critical or racist or whatever. It's just like, you just don't really resonate quite, and that's, I think, the deeper point. Rather than people are being racist. I mean, they may be, which is crazy in this day and age, but generally speaking, I think it's just the resonance of like, we don't share a common perspective or history here,
right?
And there's something in that. There's something in that, isn't there?
There's going to be a barrier in really being able to belong.
It's intangible, but I have a little bit of that experience. I would also, I suppose, ask. I mean, people that think it's exclusive, like you've made this kind of thing, and they're locked outside, and they're kind of like wondering, "Oh, what's going on the inside that's different that I can't?" Right. Well, what is going on? Is it different at all? I mean, you mentioned a little bit on a podcast I listened to that there was, that you could point out to women of color that it wasn't necessarily to do with a different body shape, that they couldn't do the posture, they just weren't doing the work, right? I mean, is it, are there different experiences to be had within the OYA group apart from just the centrality of belonging?
I think there are, in that there's a difference in culture, let me put it that way. And that is not specifically due to the fact that we're Black women and women of color. It's specific to the fact that we're trying to build community. So when we come together, it's not about, there's this I try not to work in negatives, but I'm going to work in negatives a bit right now. So when you come into this space, no one's judging you for the clothes that you're wearing, the brands that you're wearing, what you're what you're eating, and so forth, right? So we just take all of that out. We don't expect, and we, even as faculty, we don't wear kind of the tight fitting popular brands. We're not replicating those patterns in the space. And so I think that can help in the beginning. It's also, again, it's more about holistic wellness and creating an environment in which people can really open up, be vulnerable, be present to what's coming up. And we very much honor the origins of any practice that is being utilized in this space. So we have, for example, a Reiki master I can't imagine a Reiki master anywhere offering Reiki and not explaining what it comes from, right? And similarly, we have psychotherapists and psychological body workers, and all of these people who are honoring the lineage in which they've studied. And in, if you will, the wide, expansive yoga lineages that exist, we're talking about more than just postures, right? When we're talking about, we really go into the origins of this faith and wisdom and philosophy tradition, and also have to do that in a way that people who come from different wisdom, faith, and spiritual traditions feel comfortable with it. So we're not dogmatic with anything that we offer. We're not saying this is the only way, this is the only path. We're really giving people space to have their own experience, and at the same time honoring that this is a practice, whatever the practice is, this is a practice that has helped us. So I think there are a lot of elements that make it a different experience.
I was going to say, now I do feel excluded. It sounds it sounds great. If only we could have more of that in the in the regular yoga sphere. I mean,
right.
Not only you're doing something great to support women of color, and make people feel comfortable and belonging. It also sounds a fantastic yoga offering. And I have to mention Stacie's book, which she sent me before the podcast to read, and it's a fantastic book, and it really fleshes out. I think what I was saying to you before is that it's democratic, it's approachable, but it's also not watered down. I mean, Stacie, really uses the terminology, that's quite precise and technical, as well as, making it practical and kind of inclusive as well. So I think you're treading a fine line and you're doing it well. I mean, I suppose one thing I got kind of fixated on at the start of your explanation was the fact that you don't. Do you not allow I mean, it's a silly thing after everything you said, but do you not allow the faculty members not to wear the brands? They just can't wear? I would love not to see. If I didn't see another little certain logo again, it would be too soon, Yeah.
No, it's not even about allowing or not allowing. I think the people that I work with, we're all just kind of at that stage in our careers and our practice where we're just happy to come in, loose clothing that's comfortable. There's no one, obviously in the book, Yoga as Resistance, Equity and Inclusion on and off the mat, I do talk to different, if you will, professionals across the yoga industry, quote unquote industry. And so I am talking to teachers, I am talking to studio managers or owners, and I am talking to brands. And I do, just for people who haven't read the book, I do mention a brand that I feel very confident is on a journey of, and was really founded with belonging in mind. So we do wear brands, but we might not wear those brands that, are the most popular that you come across different social media channels. And it's not about being allowed or not, but honestly, if you're doing a workshop, let's just say we have an urban retreat coming up this Saturday. If you're like sitting in circles and maybe only 20% of the time you're practicing posture, do you really feel comfortable sitting in like these tight leggings and like crop tops for an entire day? Probably not. Most people feel a tension around, self-consciousness around their body. I know I do. After 2 years of COVID, I have what I call my COVID belly. And so like, I don't want to, so I'm happy to sit in baggier clothes and just relax and not worry about like my pooch sticking out and everyone looking at it, because no one cares.
That's a nice word for it. Yeah. I don't know what happened. I mean, it's like when I started, we didn't have the brand. We had, sometimes you'd wear like either like surf shorts or cycle shorts, depending, right? Or even, I mean, it was just a different nature, and it's just, I don't know how things have become so harsh in something which should be so gentle and nurturing. And it has wound up to be like, I mean, even for example, the cost of the pants and stuff, if you go into these shops, I mean, that's that's exclusive in the first place. I mean, it's,
right.
Crazy. It shouldn't be like that. So, I mean, what you're doing is, it's spreading out much more than, just for this, inclusivity thing. But on that note, I suppose, how do you take that out? I know you've done advisory work and you do advisory work for different brands and yoga centers, etc., on how to, make sure that they have the correct policies in play. And there was a funny one recently when I was listening to you on a podcast that you're having a discussion, and I think it came up, well, you can't just use your staff. You can't just kind of say, oh, well, you happen to be a black staff member. Well, you can take care of the. It just sounded like it was kind of hilarious to think that would be the case, that people will be doing that. So can you just walk us through a little bit about how, for example, I'm thinking of an obvious big yoga center in London, for example, how you might go and help them make the studio more inclusive.
So I won't name my clients, but it is well known, and it is in the public domain that I work with the largest yoga studio chain here in London. And, it's a process, and it's something that you can't expect things to change overnight, because what's difficult about this work is it's not just an external change process where we change processes and then, yay, we're done. Right? There's a lot of internal work that has to happen at the same time for the external work to be held sustainable. That's what I often talk about with my clients. After George Floyd's murder in 2020, obviously we're, deep in our first lockdown here in the UK. Then there's this movement for Black lives across the world. And a lot of yoga studios were confronted with some of their missteps, right? Many of them posted black squares on Instagram. The black square had nothing to do with what they were posting about, but they were trying to show some solidarity without knowing much. And that's always the problem, right? When we want to take action, but we haven't done the work yet. And so many of the members of the OYA community said, no, we're not having it anymore. And that's how I wound up working with a lot of studios, teacher training schools. And there was this resistance because many of them would say things like, but we're kind. Yes, I'm happy for you that you are kind, but being kind is not intentional enough to undo work of centuries, right? And so there's this resistance like, oh, if I am being told I have to do this work, then I'm being called racist. No, you're not. Or if I'm being told that I have to do this work, then you're saying that, we treat people badly or we're exclusive. No, what we're saying is you have to do this work. Full stop. We all have to do it, irrespective of our identities, irrespective of our backgrounds. We all have to do the work because of the society in which we've grown up. A lot of that is already ingrained in it, right? It's ingrained in the systems and the institutions, and we don't even see it. That's why when we go on something like Instagram and do, search hashtag yoga and see white, likely female, likely skinny, bendy bodies, we might not question it because unfortunately that has been the default.
Yeah, it's so normative that you don't even see it anymore. Yeah.
Right. And so that, the work is really an unlearning process. And as yogis, we love that word. Oh, unlearning. That comes up all the time in Kundalini. So, when you,
okay.
a lot.
Never done that Kundalini, right?
So if what I've been able to do in my work is really make it relatable so that people move out of their defensiveness and really are in a place of openness and understanding, okay, yes, I am white and I am this and I am that. And no one is saying that automatically makes me, a bad person or a racist or whatever. And and I'm sure some people listening might be concerned that I'm, holding hands or speaking to the fragility, but I'm actually not. I'm ensuring that we can get the work done. Because it's one thing if I go in as a consultant and, I say, and I do my work and I do my interviews and I do my focus groups and we have our workshops. And then I put this great plan together and it falls flat because the other work was left unmanaged, the internal piece. And so it is really important in a way that it may not be with a merger and acquisition, even though mergers and acquisitions also fail because of culture. So it's really the same thing. If we're not looking at culture, if we're not looking at the internal piece, then we can't actually get to the work.
What is the practical work of this? I suppose, I'd like you to flesh it out a bit. And yes, I think just to comment on what you've just said, I suppose it's easy to get trapped as a white person in the guilt. And I think what you're more saying is like, well, that, and many notable people have said as well, it's like, well, yes, there's work to be done, but it's easy to, and then the guilt and the shame comes and then you never get past that. It's like, well, we don't, you don't want, no one wants someone else to feel guilty or, shamed. That's not helpful. And it doesn't, rectify or make anything better in the future. Right. So I think, putting people at ease and saying, well, it wasn't necessarily your fault, right? No one's blaming you necessarily, but we're just saying there are normative conditioned responses in place that we have to be, we have to be able to see, and they're closer than your nose. So, you really need to be quite thoughtful and make conscious effort for quite a period of time, to see your responses and kind of like, how do they call it? Your unconscious prejudices, you talk about the work. Many people talk about the work. And I asked Lashana Small, who also appeared talking about a similar subject on the Gear and Yoga podcast. What is the actual measures that you can say you're putting in place to change things?
Sure. I just want to speak really quickly. That's a really important point that you mentioned about guilt and shame. So guilt works slightly differently than shame because guilt is a bit more externally focused, whereas shame is really, I am a bad person. And once shame is settled in, so instead of saying, I did something wrong, guilt, I say, I'm a bad person. And then when I do that, now I'm in this place of paralysis almost. And as long as the mindset is still stuck on I'm a bad person, it's really hard to get into an open position for change. So that's a really important point. And that is exactly what I'm trying to steer clear of is shame. When it comes to the actual work, and I will just say, I do outline this in great detail in the book for those interested. And again, I do that for teachers, for teacher trainer schools, studio owners, and brands. But just to make some examples from a teaching point of view first, often what I would hear and continue to hear when I consult with folks is, oh, well, we don't have XYZ where I am. I consulted with folks who were in Scotland, outside of Edinburgh. Oh, well, we don't have that many XYZ. And first of all, that's not a constructive argument, because
well, you might not have them because they don't come. They don't,
exactly.
Because they're around, but they don't come because
exactly. They might be there, but also there's this notion that only what's visible is what matters. But you don't know. I always talk to teachers about, you don't know who's sitting in front of you. You don't know the histories and herstories that they're bringing with them in that body that they carry. So that's one part. But another part is, in doing this work that makes your class more accessible for even the most marginalized, then you're making it a place of belonging for everyone. Everyone benefits when you do that work. So one example that I make in the book, that I make in the book specifically because I've made it in so many different workshops and it really resonates, is, there are these in the US and the UK specifically, they're calling them culture wars. I think it's more than that, but we'll use that word. There are these culture wars taking place right now around gender. And irrespective of where you sit on that spectrum, not going into it, but irrespective of where you sit on that spectrum, we have to acknowledge that there are people who identify as women, who were born designated female at birth, right? Who don't menstruate. There are people who are designated female at birth who have not been able to conceive a child. There are people who are designated female at birth who have all these other things that are not mainstream topics, right? Only recently have we started talking about menstruation and menopause and these things in the mainstream. And it's still a bit mainstream adjacent, I'd say. So when making assumptions around who can give birth and who can menstruate, and, the power of a woman being in giving birth to a child, that could be really triggering for someone who has been on a fertility journey and has been unsuccessful, right? And that actually happened in a class from a client. The female teacher was kind of just going on and about it, even though it was like a general class. It wasn't a pregnancy class. It wasn't a women only class. It was just a general class where the person who was suffering, and I use the word suffering because that is what the person called it, suffering from infertility, was completely taken off guard by the conversation. And it threw her in her own feelings of shame about not being able to do this thing that was so important to her. And she didn't return to yoga for almost a year. And didn't feel comfortable speaking up until this whole conversation was taking place in 2020 around inclusion in yoga. And so a lot of people think when they see this body that I inhabit as a Black woman, that when I'm talking about inclusion in yoga, I'm only talking about Black people. And that's not true. That's not true. I'm talking about inclusion in yoga. There are a lot of people who are not participating today. With a lot of different identities.
And I think you make a good point. Is like with the yoga studios saying in Edinburgh or Scotland or wherever, say, well, we don't have many of them. It's like, well, even if you have one, I mean, you've got a couple of people that are marginalized identities, right? One, firstly, and secondly, by making those people fit in, you make everyone fit in because everyone's harboring lack of confidence and sense of difference somewhere, in their lives, right? Like. Yeah, I mean, and in nurturing everyone, you just bring the majority with you as well. So, I think it's fantastic. I mean, it's another example of this. Recently, a friend of mine, she had a stillbirth, right? And she was trying to go to a postnatal class. But of course, in the postnatal class, it was terribly triggering, right? Because, and it does happen. And it happens more than, one is aware of, right? So, I mean, I think we all need to just we're doing this thing, which is an incredibly, kind of new thing. I'm taking yoga to the mainstream, right? Taking this thing, which is a potent discipline of unlocking trauma and tension and deep energetic blocks in the body. And we're just learning how to do it now. And it's such a recent endeavor, in the last 40 years, the public yoga class, and really 20 odd years that it's really exploded, that, this is really the infancy, and we need to learn how to, put the foundations down properly now, planning for the future, So, I mean, how would you see, would you have any aims and wishes for how do you see your vision transpiring or evolving, over time? I mean, how would you like to see things going?
Yeah, I'm cautious with that. And I'm also aware that there's not one way to get it right. That can be very hard to accept when, especially people of marginalized identities, we really just want to get to this place of where there's no more marginalization, right? And I know that that's like my simple answer. I want to get to a place where in yoga and beyond, everyone, literally everyone of all identities, can have the choice to access what is a very profound and transformative practice. Because I don't think more broadly, when I look at what's happening in the world, we really need people sitting still with their thoughts. We really need people understanding in the moment what is triggering them so they have a choice to respond rather than react. We need that, right? In this world where there's violence toward the earth, there's violence towards humans, there's violence towards animals. We need to see that change. So that is my very short answer. What I'm hopeful for in my own lifetime is to see kind of a commodification. In the book, I talk about hyper commodification of yoga, hyper consumerism. And I say that my first degree is a master's of science in economics. And I just say that because people have assumptions about what yogis do and don't do. I have a master's of science in economics, and I'm not here to demonize capitalism, but there is something very problematic with neoliberalism in the sense that everything is about yes, no, I don't like it, I want it, I wanted this, I want that. And for the yoga industry, again, quote unquote industry, we see that same pattern being replicated. And what I would really hope is that we can move away from that, that we can really come to recognize first and foremost that this practice is from South Asia. And it was denied the people who grew up in it during British colonialism. And today, what we practice is a direct consequence of that colonialism. And so what can we contribute to decolonize the practice? What can we contribute to move away from, some people call it cultural appropriation or cultural misappropriation, whatever you call it. What can we do to honor the roots, the tradition, and still stay true to whatever we've grown up with? I'm not saying that, you have to convert in any way, but there is a way to honor the roots of the practice and stop sacrificing the integrity of the practice for the sake of a dollar.
Yeah. I mean, can you speak any more specifically, any examples of because people will say, well, what do you mean? I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm not appropriating or, just, I like these yoga classes and, like my local yoga, right? Give some tangible examples that people can get their teeth into a little bit, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't, are your listeners more teachers? Are they practitioners?
Both. We have so many listeners that a whole spectrum of people. Okay. Yeah.
So I think it's what I struggle with when it comes to teachers and people who trademark Sanskrit words. I struggle with they're often, so people do not come for me and tell me not everyone, but often these teachers are not truly honoring the fact that this isn't something that just occurred to them. And even if they feel like they've built on something from their own teachers, they've not actually invented anything new. This is a practice that has been around for thousands of years, right? So anything that we're doing is still definitively embedded in a practice that has existed. And so I think move out of the ego of this desire to say, I invented something or I created something, and really acknowledge the roots. That's what teachers can do. Also, I understand the studio models. People feel like 60 minutes isn't enough to do that, and I would disagree. There are many ways. I am a part of a collective called Radical Darshan. We founded a 300-hour Yoga Alliance accredited advanced yoga teacher training. And we even pushed back in the process of becoming accredited. We weren't sure if we wanted to do it, but we eventually decided we wanted to do it because we want people who go through what is a very intense training with us for that work to be acknowledged. And so we pushed back with Yoga Alliance on some specific points. Our faculty is predominantly South Asian. And we said, no, this is also yoga, because Yoga Alliance at some point was like, is that really yoga? And we were like, yes. And we outlined, in the Bhagavad Gita, it says this and this and this. So there are ways. And so when we teach our students about, yes, we understand you have a 60-minute, a 75-minute, a 90-minute, and these are the ways where you can still ensure that the origins of yoga show up in your class. It doesn't always have to be an elaborate ritual for people to get just a taste, because my own experience in starting yoga in Germany over 15 years ago was, I didn't know that it came from India.
Really? That's crazy, isn't it?
And again, going back to my master's program, a big chunk of my master's was in the South Asia Institute. We have, at the university I studied, we have a very renowned South Asia Policy Institute. So if someone should know it, it should have been me.
You honestly didn't know that? You're just saying that? You're just saying that?
No.
You honestly didn't know?
I honestly did not know the way that they were teaching. There was no mention of India.
I mean, another funny thing that strikes me as kind of ironic is, that any master in India, albeit Krishnamacharya or whoever else, would always dedicate the work they've done to their teacher. Say, well, it wasn't me that did it. It was, it was them, right? So it's kind of funny, isn't it? That now people are just taking personal responsibility for this work. Yeah. I mean, anything practical that you can now, just as we wrap up now, the say for teachers, say you're me, like just a general white male teacher, getting more informed, relatively new to the subject, and you're trying, and you want to make sure that you're not, unconsciously doing stupid stuff, basically, saying, because I came from a place where, this wasn't even an issue 20 years ago, right? Like, I'm sure I was offending people left, right, and center, but, it hadn't come to the collective consciousness, now it is. Now, and we're very fortunate it is. And how can I, and how can we use certain language, maybe certain cues, certain ways of when people come in or when they leave, or can you flesh this out at all?
Yes, there's a lot that we can do. Obviously, I'll just give 3 quick points. One is to acknowledge, as a teacher specifically, the power that comes with that role. And power is one of those words that triggers a lot of different emotions in different people. People have different reactions to that word. But in a teaching role, irrespective of what you're teaching, you have a lot of power there. And so acknowledging that is a really first important step. And so that power shows up in different ways. It shows up in how you lay out your room. It shows up in how you talk to your students as they come in, when they leave, how you instruct. So I was talking to a friend the other day. I was an athlete when I was a child, and I always assumed that I would just automatically do vinyasa. Like, obviously vinyasa is going to be my thing, because that's the most, in my mind, years and years ago, please, that's the most athletic form. And I hate it. And I absolutely hate it. And it took me a long time to realize why, even though I would force myself to go, why I hated it. It was because teachers weren't giving me space. They were saying, inhale, and then exhale, and then now move, and I was, I was just trying to breathe the way the teacher was telling me to breathe, and it wasn't working for me. And I've just never gone back. After a good while of really trying it, the teachers that I was encountering, they weren't giving me space to breathe and move at my own pace.
I don't think it's possible. It's not possible in a vinyasa class, honestly. I don't. You're not on your own. I go see. I did one vinyasa class. I was just laughing all the way through because it's you cannot possibly regulate your breath and whilst you're looking at the front and trying to get your leg over to do crazy thing or whatever it's called. It's just ridiculous. Like,
right? Yeah. Okay. Great. I feel a lot better now.
Yeah. So you're not on your own there. Don't worry. Yeah.
So that's number one. Acknowledge the power that you have in your role and use it for good. Number two. Really simple thing here. Don't use gendered language. That comes up a lot in yoga classes. Oh, the masculine and the feminine. Yes. And we all, irrespective of our sex and irrespective of our gender, we all inhabit the masculine and the feminine. So don't assume anything about any of your students and let them choose what they're doing. And don't relate masculine and feminine to man and woman. Really simple. And number three, is something, because you've asked me to be specific, so there will be a fourth one. So number three is speak things into the space, because it takes out some of the power and the tension that is perhaps escalating or building or just kind of suffocating the space. So for example, I can't imagine over the last 2 years where I was doing yoga online with my teachers, which they would have never done before. I can't imagine they're not saying something about why we're doing that, right? Obviously, someone would say, in these times of COVID, we are doing this, this, and that, right? Or when it's really, really hot in a place like London, every teacher is going to speak to the fact that it's really, really hot. And then everyone that tension kind of releases. Okay, the teacher understands it's hot. They're not going to expect me to do all these crazy things. But we don't do that on the touchier things. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but it doesn't happen as often. I was not in one class where someone talked about George Floyd's murder. It would have meant a lot to a lot of people. I've not attended a class where, people talked about there are things happening all over the world every day. So just speak to people's, potential mental, emotional state, because it really helps to feel seen. Don't be afraid of speaking it into the space. When you speak it into the space, it transforms the space. So 1, recognize your power and your role. 2, don't use gendered language. 3, speak things into the space, even if it feels uncomfortable, because it will help someone in the space. And lastly, inform yourself. Read things like my book and many other books that exist. There are a lot of great books out there. And really start to get comfortable with these conversations. Be courageous and have those conversations, both with your peers and with the people, your colleagues, peers, and whomever else, to really understand that this is something we all have a responsibility in. Not just a few of us.
That's fantastic. I haven't got any other words to. I'll leave it there and spoil it by more babble from me. So I want to say thanks. Thanks so much for coming on the Keen Yoga podcast. And it was a wonderful episode. And we're really grateful to have you. And yes, people can find Stacie at OYA. Was it website? We'll put the links in the bio bit at the end. So don't worry about that. They'll find you and read the book. It's a really bloody good book. As I say, read Stacie's book. It is technical and as well as very approachable, down to earth language, but some serious stuff there. She's talking about proper yoga philosophy as well as ways that we can be more conscious. So thank you again. It's been wonderful to meet you.
Thank you.
Thank you.